delegate to the National Committee of the Green Party of the United States. Today I'm going to be having a conversation with Dario Hunter to discuss questions posed by the membership of the Young Ecosocialist Caucus to our party's presidential candidates. Dario, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Not going crazy in quarantine?
Not at all. Keeping too busy for that.
Excellent. All right, so let's get started. In light of this pandemic urging us to adopt internationalist approaches to crises, how are you going to develop cooperative schemes with other governments beyond trade? And how are you going to protect workers both inside and outside the US through these alliances without picking sides between rival nations?
That's an excellent question, and it speaks particularly to the approach, the entire focus of our campaign, which is ending war and building peace. I think it's very important to ensure that in order to build those fruitful relationships internationally, that we have a relationship built on trust. And right now, the world does not trust the United States, and with very good cause, because the United States has spent a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of effort in destabilizing parts of the world for profit. And so that absolutely has to come to an end to start with. And our campaign's the only campaign talking about ending the military-industrial complex, period. We are ending our engagement with military action and moving towards instead peace building. That's an important key piece. We also envision our environmental agenda as a part of that overall platform of ending conflict in order to be able to work fruitfully on issues such as expanding the concepts of the Green New Deal internationally. In order to do that, we have to be able to have better relationships with other countries. And when we end the U.S. imperialism, we have a platform to be best enabled to do that. Now, in terms of protecting workers and in terms of trade, what we have to do is look within ourselves and completely reorient our system, our economic system. Capitalism kills. I am a socialist, and I believe that this present capitalist system is not sustainable and must come to an end. We as a country will be turning instead towards a system where workers own the fruits of their labor. People talk about workplace democracy, but we're talking about something above and beyond that. We're talking about clear, defined ownership, where workers can take pride in the work that they do because the work is owned by them. And so we as a country are going to invest in that, in building up co-ops and communities all across this country. And that has an international scope as well, because our focus in terms of dealing with other countries will be in building up quality of life rather than engaging in trade to make profit for a select group of people in our country who are billionaires and perhaps soon trillionaires in the case of Jeff Bezos. We will be engaging in trade to improve quality of life for all workers around the world, because we understand that not only is that's the right thing to do economically, but we understand that that too is a part of the mission of building peace that our future Department of Peace will engage in. So to recap, we are reframing and reshaping our relationship with other countries by ending U.S. imperialism. We are focusing our energies and our efforts towards internally ensuring workers own the fruits of their labor, while externally connecting with countries in a way that encourages that perspective and improves quality of life all across the world. And when we can do that, end war and improve quality of life for all humanity, we will reduce the conflicts and bring about a circumstance where all countries can work internationally to conquer crises like the one that we are facing now, COVID-19. We could work more fruitfully when we are not engaged in this capitalist Hunger Games that people call competition.
Thank you. That's a very good answer. I think it's very interesting how you identified capitalism and imperialism as the sort of root causes of the oppression faced by American workers and workers everywhere existing under American hegemony. Getting down to root causes, one of the beliefs and critiques that many Greens have of capitalism in the United States is that it and the settler colonial framework that underlies American imperialism began and expanded from the oppression of indigenous people within and without the continental United States. And this leads me to the second question posed by our members. What steps will you take to ensure self-determination for indigenous peoples and decolonization inside and outside of the United States?
Another excellent question, and something that's really important to us as a campaign. We want to ensure first and foremost that we recognize the sovereignty of indigenous nations. And I mean that not only in terms of the nations present here in North America, whose land was stolen to produce this country that we live under, but also indigenous peoples all across the globe. We are seeing in the midst of this crisis the inequalities caused by the imperialist system that has disenfranchised indigenous nations. We're seeing them magnified in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. And there's a lot of suffering on the part of indigenous nations, the Navajo Nation being an example that has attracted a lot of attention recently. And what we have to do is to ensure that we have a balance of protecting our commitment to their sovereignty while also ensuring that we provide them the level of assistance and support that we would provide any nation to improve quality of life, reduce conflict, and save human lives. So the indigenous nations in this country, we have to respect all of the treaties that we have signed with them. We have to cease our attempts to profit additionally off of their land because we've profited for centuries already. We have to cease the forms of environmental racism, in effect, that this country has engaged in by polluting their lands. And we have to invest in and support the outgrowth of economic opportunities within those nations while also understanding and respecting the sovereignty in terms of the decision making that has to come from those communities. Now, we're talking about this in an international sense. And so it doesn't escape my notice that there's struggles for indigenous people all across this globe, and that the U.S. has been engaged in those struggles, the struggles for the recognition of their sovereignty in negative ways. Look at what occurred recently in Bolivia, the coup effort there. That has serious implications for the struggles of indigenous peoples across the globe. Look at Palestine. The U.S. has been aiding and abetting the abuses against the Palestinian people for quite some time. And so the U.S.'s track record in terms of dealing with indigenous peoples globally is abysmal. And that's why it's so important that we completely reshape the domestic and international paradigm. Domestically, we must treat indigenous nations as nations with full rights to control what's within their sphere, while also lifting them up and supporting them with our resources, especially considering all that we've done to them. But we must also end the imperialism that is disenfranchising and oppressing indigenous peoples all across the globe, from Bolivia to Palestine and everywhere in between. That's the only way we're going to be true to the idea, to the principles of recognizing the sovereignty of indigenous peoples. It must be global as well as domestic.
Very good. It's great to hear you take such a strong stance on the emancipation of indigenous peoples within this country and around the world. There was something that you mentioned in your answer to the previous question that sort of touches upon one of the latter questions that a member presented. So I sort of wanted to hit on it now. What is your position on establishing the federal level cabinet recommended by Marianne Williamson, the Department of Peace? And more generally, how will you use this and the institutions within the executive branch to implement a green foreign policy?
It's interesting because we are the only campaign still at this point, to my knowledge, that's calling for a Department of Peace in this green race. Now, I've not heard my colleague get on board with that, Mr. Hawkins, yet, although we have advanced a number of ideas that fellow colleagues in the race have eventually agreed with and taken on board, and I'm happy with that. That would make us very happy as a campaign. To steal our ideas, please. We're all in this together to create a greener, fairer world. Department of Peace, I think, is essential, and it's crucial. What it says, not just internally, but to the world, is we are going to invest as much energy and effort and passion in peace as we once invested in war. We are changing and shifting the paradigm so fundamentally. And it has to be understood what that means. We're talking about how this is going to relate to other members of the cabinet, how this is going to function administratively in government. The President of the United States often has to have these tete-a-tetes with various military heads, people who are charged with the mission of marching into other countries and carrying forward the capitalist agenda to make profit, no matter how many people are killed. People who are responsible on a higher level for what on a lower level becomes these nasty drone wars that kill civilians, children, that rain death from the sky. These are people the president is accustomed to sitting down with and having conversations with, because that is a big part of what drives U.S. policy. All that's going to be coming to an end. I can't underline how much that would be a dramatic change, not just here, but for the rest of the globe. Because in many ways, because we are such a big force internationally, the toxic things we do also make us a big source of toxicity internationally. And that would come to an end. The cabinet level Department of Peace, the head of that department would be sitting at that table where you would otherwise be having those conversations about military engagement. And it would connect with other departments in ways that would help our mission, which would be to improve quality of life internationally to end conflict. Any conflicts that might arise over resources, over contrived lack of availability of resources to cause conflict, those would be minimized internationally by the Department of Peace liaising with the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, liaising with various other departments to ensure that quality of life in every regard, domestically, internationally, is going to be protected and ensured. So it would be a very important and a crucial department indeed. And it needs to be, because peace needs to be a number one focus, top level focus for this country. So we're proud to be the only campaign advancing this idea. And we are saying, we're not just going to slash the military 50%, 75%. We're ending it. We're ending it. We're reducing that budget because, as it happens, it costs less to create peace than it does to cause war. It does. And it's much more impactful. But that remainder of that budget will no longer be a military one. It will be devoted for the Department of Peace.
Mm-hmm. I really liked what you said about the association between the president and the sort of military leadership which characterizes much of the American executive. It reminded me very much of something that the journalist Chris Hedges mentions. He cites Thucydides, who said that, as the Athenian empire all the way back in antiquity expanded and expanded and expanded, the tyranny that they exported to their colonies were eventually imported back into Athens and, ended up destroying that democracy. And I think we saw a very similar thing with the Roman Empire and perhaps now, with the American Republic. So I think that was a very interesting point that you made about the association between the president and the sort of Praetorian general leadership that characterizes the executive. So pivoting back to COVID-19, among those most hard hit by the pandemic are those who are incapable of following the guidelines laid out by the National Institutes of Health, by Dr. Fauci and the Coronavirus Task Force. I'm referring to the unhoused community in the United States. So what would your administration's response to COVID-19 be for renters and the unhoused community in America?
I have to point out that living presently in California is leading the crisis in terms of the unhoused. And it's really sad as you travel up and down this state, as I had to for the sake of this campaign before the stay-at-home orders. Every major city, there are large tent cities, or multiple tent cities in places like LA and Oakland, for instance. And it's really shameful because this country has hoarded a massive amount of resources and is expending a great deal of resources for things that we shouldn't be, for war, for instance. But there just doesn't seem to be any concern genuinely for the unhoused. That was the case before this crisis. We have to ensure that we create circumstances where it is not the case during and after. So our COVID-19 plan, which is a very ambitious one, and you can read in full detail at dariohunter.com, includes a plan to remedy the situation of the unhoused. Yes, we must have a mass mobilization in this country to create more housing. But we must also recognize the fact that there are resources that are presently available that can be turned into housing, including government-owned properties. Here in California, for example, Caltrans owns certain properties that might have at one time been used to demolish the house on it, build a freeway over it, just for example. And at this point, with projects having changed, the properties are still owned and retained by them. At this point, for land speculation, no more than that. So some community members have decided to take those properties over and squat on them. They shouldn't have had to have done that. Those properties should have been made available and turned over. And I would do that for any governmental owned properties that can be made available for housing or turned over to that purpose. That includes military properties, because remember, we're winding down the military and the military industrial complex. So those properties, those resources can be made available for housing, in addition to a mass mobilization that will create housing, alongside the mass mobilization we envision under the Green New Deal. So there'll be multiple mass mobilizations that will also help create jobs. It will help stimulate economically the country in building that housing. In terms of renters, we have to recognize a number of truths about renting. Rent is too high all across the country. It's at different rates across the country, but it's still too high, especially in a place like California. Okay, so we need to, of course, regulate rent, have rent control, very clear and very firm measures in terms of regulating rent. But we also have to do, in the midst of this crisis, is ensure, as our campaign has said, that there is no rent, no mortgage, no evictions for the entire duration of the crisis. And I don't mean a shortened form version of the crisis where you claim the crisis is either over or has been abated somewhat and you force everyone to go back to work at their peril, as they're doing right now. I mean the true duration of the crisis, and no corporate bailouts alongside it. We're not talking about just a moratorium on rent where you won't pay for a little bit of while. Maybe you'll have to pay a huge lump sum at the end. None of that garbage. Cancel rent. It's very simple. And do not pump money into corporations and banks claiming that if you don't do that, well, the economy will bottom out. It will fall apart. When I think about the economy, I think about the everyday struggle of everyday Americans. The economy for them has already fallen apart. They can't afford rent. They can't afford basic necessities. Our number one focus must be them. So no rent, no mortgage, no evictions, and no bailouts. Corporate bailouts, that is. No corporate bailouts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really great to hear you say that, especially seeing how so much of the energy behind the party duopoly, the Democrats and the Republicans, what might better be called the corporate party, have been, just to pass bailout and after bailout for the major financial institutions, for corporations and all of that. So pivoting a little bit, the Young Ecosocialist Caucus is first and foremost an interest group on behalf of the younger members of the Green Party. And one of the foremost issues that young people in this country face concerns the rights of adopted people. What would your administration and campaign do to ensure that adopted children have the same access to their original birth certificates as other folks do?
There has to be a legal framework in place to ensure that and enshrine that right legally. And it is a right. It's really a human right. It's an issue that I've been tracking for some time, and there are a number of activists who have been working on this on multiple fronts in multiple states. There's been some movement on this legally in states such as New York, for example, creating a legal framework to ensure that people can exercise that right to have that basic information. And I think what has to happen is there needs to be some movement on a federal level with appropriate respect for the separation between federal and state, but also recognizing the power that the federal government has to be able to move issues like this forward legislatively and if only just diplomatically. So we're seeing movement in certain states. There needs to really be national clarity. And that has to be, I believe, an issue that's dealt with on multiple fronts, which the president, through his bully pulpit, can help put on the agenda. I would say that overall, in terms of the rights of adopted persons, there are a number of issues that there needs to be legislative attention turned towards. This is just one of them. And our system in this country, through foster care and the process of adoption, is really broken. It's truly broken. We have a lot of need in this country, need that's not being met, but if it is being met, creates, unfortunately, legal quandaries like the one that we're discussing because the lack of a robust legal framework protect people's rights. And so, in a larger sense, there needs to be a lot more unpacking on how we deal with both the foster care system and the process of adoption in this country to protect the rights of all, but also ensure that children have opportunity and a fair shot at a good home.
Um, Moving forward to another issue within the rights of adopting children, a 2012 study found that by the National Council on Disability found that parents with disabilities are more likely to lose custody of their children after divorce and face significant barriers to adopting children. What does your administration intend to do to change this, as well as to improve the rights of disabled people within the United States more generally?
I think there also needs to be some work on this issue from a legal standpoint and to ensure that we remove any barriers that exist in terms of discrimination. I believe that a lot of this is discrimination in other regards against disabled persons feeding into this particular area as well. We have to look at the larger landscape for disabled persons in this country. The fact that there's some serious issues in terms of employment discrimination, the lack of an ability and equal ability to obtain suitable employment, and employers are unfortunately engaging in various forms of discrimination our current legal framework has not really caught up to or adequately dealt with. And I think this speaks to a larger issue. Our campaign has spoken about on numerous occasions, completely revamping our approach to employment discrimination. The EEOC, in my opinion, has rendered itself all but useless. And this is whether we're talking about discrimination against disabled persons in the workforce, or racial discrimination, or gender-based discrimination, or any other kind. And so we really need to have an EEOC or completely revamped department that has some genuine teeth to be able to tackle these issues. We need to invest in employment opportunities more so for disabled persons. We need to reshape the legal framework in dealing with adoption in that community and ensure that there's genuine sensitivity for the unique issues that disabled persons may face in that process and as adoptive parents. And we need to ensure that as a country, that we have included in all of the ways that we factor in the disparity, the inequality that exists in this country, the voice and the say-so of people who live that experience from that community. And this is something that matters to us greatly. It's all well and good to talk about how we would deal with this issue that faces this community. What we really need is more voices from that community rising to the forefront and having democratic voice and choice and say. And so whether we are talking about dealing with employment discrimination that negatively affects the lives of disabled persons and disabled adoptive parents, or we're talking about the process itself of adoption and how it negatively discriminates against disabled persons, every bureaucratic aspect of that needs to have persons from that community engaged actively in decision making. Otherwise, all you are doing is deciding for and talking at people from a massively marginalized and oppressed community. And that's not how we as a campaign envision the new, greener, fairer America.
I think that that's an extremely important point that, one of the major missions of our party is for any particular issue that affects a group, bringing the voices of that group to the forefront, presenting their perspectives and allowing them to set the laws that would govern the treatment of that particular problem. One of the major factors in the Green Party that brought me into the Green Party was the way that it highlighted the voices of gay and autistic people regarding issues facing those communities. One of the most widespread forms of oppression against gay and autistic people are the various forms of conversion therapy that exist and are used against those communities, including gay conversion therapy and applied behavioral analysis. What would your administration do to combat the prevalence of these forms of oppression?
I happen to be out and proud, openly gay man myself. I formerly served as the head of the Pride Center in the Mahoning Valley in Ohio. And in that tenure, I heard a lot of unfortunate stories and circumstances about various kinds of oppression and discrimination that people faced, including transgender persons kicked out of their apartments, having lost their jobs. And people need to understand that there's a great deal of discrimination still happening all across this country to LGBTQIA plus people. People seem to think that because you see a little bit more openness on television and in popular culture, that means things have changed far more than they actually have. Some has changed. A lot has stayed the same. And one of the absolutely medieval things that serves as evidence of this is conversion therapy, the continued existence in some parts of this country of conversion therapy. Now, there have been some state efforts to ban it, to outlaw it. I think federal movement on this issue is appropriate, and or movement in concert with the states to ensure that there is nationwide consensus, agreement, and a legal framework to ban conversion therapy. This has to be the case also in regards to autistic persons and all persons who are subject to, and I hate using that term because it's completely inappropriate, conversion therapy. There's nothing wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with you if you happen to be an out and proud gay person. There is nothing wrong with you if you happen to be autistic and have the gifts that are inherent to that. And there would be nothing wrong with you if you were left-handed either. Centuries ago, they would try to convert you from being that. So it's really sad to think how far we haven't come in that regard, that we don't recognize the gifts that people have for being as unique as they are, which is how I would describe that. We need to ban what is in effect abuse. It's an abuse of human rights.
That's very interesting. I'm hoping that I can get your perspective. As I understand it, you are a leader within your faith community as a rabbi. Do I have that correct?
Yes, I am a rabbi.
So, from my perspective, as a gay man who was raised within the Catholic Church in a very Catholic community and within the Catholic school system, one of the most persistent forms of homophobia that I've noticed within the United States, in particular, and I suppose everywhere within the world, are the forms of homophobia which exist within faith communities. I'd be interested in getting your perspective as a faith leader on how these can be combated by people of faith in ways which seek to reconcile these communities rather than building up barriers within them.
That's a great question. I think more than anything else, it's interesting. The first thing that comes to me is to reach back to the activism of Harvey Milk. And part of his activism, as well as some of his contemporaries, was to encourage people to be out and proud, because when it's in people's faces and they know it exists and it's your neighbor and it's your friend and it's your cousin and it's your son, that is a part of the larger landscape of people coming to an understanding that it isn't an us versus them. It is a them versus them, and we need to stop fighting each other as human beings. We're all in the same circumstances as human beings. We're just unique in our own individual ways. Instead of otherizing people, we need to include them in the sense of what we consider us. Now, in faith communities, what that means is that people really need to speak up and speak out. In my case, I consider it to be a responsibility on my part to be out and proud in that regard, because you can't say you don't know someone then. And you can't say that this is someone that's distant from you, that's in a community that you don't understand, and this is completely remote and foreign to you, because I'm here. And I know a lot of other people like me who are here in that community. But when you're speaking up and speaking out, it also has to be purposeful. It has to be change-oriented. And I think that that's an important piece of it. And in communities like mine, I'm speaking of the larger Jewish community. We've seen the impact of that to the extent that overwhelmingly in the United States of America, the more liberal branches of Judaism, which represent the overwhelming share of anyone that considers himself even slightly religious in this country, all accept gay marriage and gay rabbis now. That was not the case a few decades ago, but a sea change came about as very purposeful conversations were created and activism was engaged in rabbinic seminaries, in local synagogues, in community organizations. That was how a sea change came about in our community. At this point, the only holdouts amongst the Jewish community are the Orthodox, and even still, there's interesting conversations happening amongst modern Orthodox communities. Ultra-Orthodox communities, as some might call them, and Hasidic communities, that's probably not going to happen, ever. But that's a small percentage of the community. And that came about because people decided that they had had enough of people just being turned out, turned away, families broken up, the hurt and the pain that that caused. And I would say, thinking outside of the Jewish paradigm, that has to be the case for all faith communities. They have to reach that point where they understand that the tenets of their faith of togetherness and love and understanding, that they just don't jive with exclusion at all. And so you have to find a way to be inclusive, and you have to find a way to be accepting, because ultimately, at least for all of the Abrahamic faiths and a number of non-Abrahamic faiths, that's a part of your faith that you really can't deny, that sense of togetherness and community building and building bridges. And so it's challenging for some of those religious communities to find a way to do that, considering their beliefs, but they're really not free to give up that challenge if they really believe in the full extent of what the values of their faith happen to be. And so I would have to point out that that's a struggle. When you decide to do that, you're really taking upon yourself a very challenging set of circumstances, and it really is something that happens in fits and starts, because it's not going to immediately conquer all resistance. Everyone coming together in the community and saying, we accept gay people in this faith community, doesn't mean that all of that resistance is going to back down. Look at the Anglican Church. It's experienced schisms over this. They're still roiling over this as we speak. It will take some time for them to sort that out, but was it the wrong decision for them to appoint a gay bishop, for instance, Gene Robinson? Absolutely not. Great guy, excellent faith leader, great breakthrough as a community. They're going to be stronger at the end of all of that. And I have to point out very briefly that what you find out sometimes is that acceptance in some faith communities only goes so far, which shows how much work we have to do. When I lost my job, as some out there watching this interview may know, because I spoke out against what was happening to Palestinians, one of the first things that a very powerful, important member of that congregation, who was a major donor and a millionaire and an owner of Phantom Fireworks, one of the first things he resorted to was homophobic comments. And that happens quite frequently. It's not just in the faith communities, but in employment. You might think that you're in a comfortable space and place and people are accepting, and then out comes all the homophobia that was all there beneath the surface the entire time, okay? So we have a lot of work to do. It's time to get up in people's faces, figuratively, and let them know that we're not only as a larger community, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, but those who aren't a member of the community, we're here, we're supportive, and you should be too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to commend you for your work on behalf of the Palestinian cause within your community. That was very brave of you, and that is certainly the kind of struggle that all peoples within their communities need to be engaged in when it comes down to a situation of settler colonialism like that. And I just wanted to thank you for your refreshing answer on that issue generally. So moving forward to one of the great debates within the Green Party today, which revolves around the issue of sex workers' rights. The Young Ecosocialist Caucus maintains that sex workers' rights are unambiguous. We believe that sex work is work, and the rights of these workers ought to be protected by the state. Regarding sex workers' rights, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, FOSTA-SESTA, were intended by lawmakers to protect sex workers on the internet by limiting their capacity to work over the internet. However, advocates of sex workers' rights and activists within the community have pointed out that by limiting their capacity to work online, the work is generally becoming more dangerous. Do you support federal decriminalization of sex work and the repeal of FOSTA, SESTA?
Okay, as a lawyer, I have to point out to start with that decriminalization is not the same thing as legalization. Okay, they are not exactly the same. You can decriminalize something and still in many ways suppress, penalize, so on and so forth. So what I support is legalization. That's a very clear distinction in terms of our campaign and other campaigns. And it's such a clear and stark distinction from other campaigns that are calling for decriminalization. I feel I need to unpack it a little bit. I don't feel there should be any legal or governmental control whatsoever on the choices you make as a human being with your body. It's unconscionable to me. And we understand this in other contexts. For example, our campaign, and I'm sure every campaign in this green race, I hope every campaign, believes very strongly in protecting reproductive rights and women's rights to have control over their own bodies and how non-negotiable that is. In that sphere and in that context, there'd be no disagreement on that amongst green candidates. For me, logically, it makes sense for a candidate such as myself to espouse also then legalization for all human beings of the ability to make other choices in regards to your body. I'm in no way putting those two issues on the same footing or necessarily comparing them. I am just laying out the logical understanding of why legalization and protection of bodily autonomy and choice needs to be and should be logically across the board in every regard. People have asked me questions about bodily autonomy for intersex persons and the long history this country has of violating that, for example. Same answer. We need to protect bodily autonomy. And so logically, it makes sense for me to say legalization, especially when you're connected to the other branch of what our campaign supports, which is destigmatization. I believe fundamentally that logically, if you support destigmatization of sex work, because we have a lot of cultural stigmatization of it and scorn heaped upon people who engage in sex work, if you believe in that, then you need to believe in something more than just decriminalization. Because if you're just saying, we're just going to decriminalize it, you're saying there's still cultural and social and societal disapproval of it, but you're going to find a way to tolerate it. And to me, that's not enough. So, legalization, destigmatization. Not a supporter of any legal framework that falls short of that. Whatever the bill, law, whatever case that might be. People need to have right of dominion over their own bodies.
That's a very important distinction. So thank you for making that and for laying that out for our listeners. Moving forward to a little bit of a different issue. Among the greatest technological issues of our time is the influx of artificial intelligence technologies into the hands of private corporations and governments. To what extent should the enforcement of online communication laws, especially the Communication Decency Act, be done through computer-controlled algorithms?
I'm very wary of this, and my answer to that would be very minimally. We understand computers have made various forms of human endeavor easier, and that computer algorithms in many regards have been a part of the ability of people to get complex work done much more simply. But we have to understand the many layers in which such computer algorithms and the ways in which artificial intelligence are dehumanizing us as a society. And some of those layers have to do with privacy. Some of those layers have to do with the dehumanizing of the workforce and taking control and the ability to engage in a profession out of the hands of human beings and placing it in the hands of automated, computerized, and in some cases, robotic work in this country. There's that layer to it. But there's also the layer of the suppression of natural human endeavor that should be protected as rights by automated computerized algorithms. And we see this all across the internet in places that have become the new public squares in which people get slapped down by algorithms, we presume in many cases there's algorithms, that suppress their free speech in bizarre ways, frankly. I can't tell you how many people that I know peripherally or some who've been engaged in our team, just getting the word out about a green campaign, who have been put in Facebook jail by likely some computer algorithm that decided that they didn't like the kind of activity is being engaged in, quite possibly designed to suppress progressive causes in general. And so, no, I want not only for us to protect our workforce, but I want for there to be human beings responsible that have to answer for these kind of actions and these activities. And so I'd say minimal. And some might accuse me of being a Luddite for that. But the kind of, air quotes, brave new world that some are envisioning, where freedom of speech is massively suppressed, the opportunities for people to, as human beings, engage in work and be responsible for that work are being diminished. That's not a world that I look upon with great positivity. Neither does the average American or specifically American workers. And so we really need to bring in the reins on that.
Mm-hmm. On a similar note, many of the people in my generation, Gen Z, and further back in the millennial generation, were radicalized or brought into liberatory politics through political education that took place over the internet. We sort of had, compilations of life experiences which awoke us to the fact that there was something fundamentally wrong in our society, but we didn't have means on our own of articulating this skepticism towards the way that our economy, that our politics were organized, and thus we found the internet, or in some cases public libraries, as places to assimilate the critiques voiced by previous generations of our society, critiques like those of Karl Marx, of Lenin, of even some of the founding fathers, and many other political voices throughout our society. What is your campaign going to do to make disenfranchised social media savvy radicals and internet leftists feel like they have a home within the Green Party of the United States?
For one thing, in order to create a home in any place in space, you have some building to do. A home begins with a foundation, and you build further on a strong foundation. And so we have to get out of our comfort zones as a party. We have to get out of little boxes in which we've confined ourselves sometimes. And we have to get out there and make those connections. So you mentioned the internet, which has been very powerful in bridging those gaps. In COVID-19, in the midst of this crisis, there's not much we could do in person, but we need to have that in-person connectivity as well. And we need to have a balanced and seamless connection between the two, because sometimes the in-person connection can influence the internet connection and vice versa. I think they complement each other very well in the case of activism. And an example of that would be for example, before the COVID-19 crisis, a great march that was organized online, a protest organized online against war with Iran. You got people who got together online and they organized coming together for this, and then they showed up in person and created this great event that showed their political will on that issue. So when I say get out of comfort zone, we're talking about organizing young people on the internet and hopefully towards the end of also off the internet. In order to do that, we have to recognize some of the barriers that have been in place in our party to making enough of that activism happen. When I was a leader of a local in the Mahoning Valley in Ohio, I looked around the table and not enough people really looked like me. And I mean that in multiple regards. I mean that also in terms of racial demographics, but I also mean that in terms of age. I was the youngest person at that table as a chair of the Mahoning County Green Party, and I would have been the youngest person in a lot of chapters. A lot of green chapters across this country. And so what we need to do is, as a party, connect with common cause organizations, okay? Do so in a way that is moving in the same direction towards certain causes that we believe in strongly. Harness the power of youth activism already taking place on these issues. to thereby help people realize that, okay, you're working with Black Lives Matter, you're working on an anti-fracking cause, as I once did in Youngstown, Ohio. Do you know the Green Party has been at the forefront of these issues for years? Do you know we have to build those bridges and make those connections, and that's going to require some of our longtime Green warriors to really get out of their comfort zone. And I get that you're not going to necessarily completely bridge the generation gap between someone who's been engaged in activism for 30 years and is now perhaps in their 60s with someone who is in their 20s and is starting out in activism and is very excited about it. That's not the goal. The goal is not for you to completely understand each other and agree with each other. The goal is for you to connect on the issues that matter to both of you and all of us as Greens, and to pass that baton. That's the goal. That's the goal. And so we have to commit to doing that. And we can do that in an ad hoc level online, connecting with various kinds of online forums and groups and organizations. But what it has to do is it has to be married with in-person action and meeting people where they are, because when you do that, people realize that you are there for them, for the causes that matter to them. So that's been a key part of my personal activism, and that has to be a part of our activism as a party, getting out of those comfort zones. And I want to point out something briefly about how important the internet is. It has been a major motivator in the democratization of ideas. We just talked about how that's been suppressed in some ways by AI and computer algorithms, and we need to get past that. But despite those stirrings, well, really, those stirrings exist because of that democratization of ideas. They want to suppress it. Despite those stirrings, it's still a lot of great changes come about because of the internet. I will never forget having been in Cuba, a place that the U.S. government demonizes so much, and seeing how connected people were to each other on the internet, on their smartphones. We're all trained to believe that everyone has been put under the oppressive thumb of socialism in Cuba, and that's just it. That's the end of the story. But you see people on their smartphones on the internet connecting, talking about all of these ideas that are swirling around in the rest of the world. It's happening there. And we need to, as a party, recognize that democratization of ideas that is happening globally and harness it and connect with it and get over whatever internal barriers are in place, even if they're just generational gap-wise, to make sure we bring those young people in and keep them.
Yeah. So picking up on that thread of sort of resolving the dialectic between younger, new activists who are extremely excited about the causes that they're being engaged in, and the older generation that is more active in electoral work and perhaps have been involved in particular struggles for long periods of time. How will you manage being an active champion for young people while also encouraging older voters within and without the Green Party?
It's interesting because I'm kind of at an in-between space and place that makes me perfect for doing that. I am younger than most candidates in this race, definitely considerably younger than my competitor in this race, and yet I'm just aged out of the Young Ecosocialists. I'm 37, so I'm just beyond it. And in fact, when I came on board as a Green, having recognized how morally bankrupt and useless the Democratic Party was, having fought them for many years, really. I had fought them and then become an independent. I had already been just barely aged out of the Young Ecosocialists. So I'm not quite so young anymore, but at the same time, I do have a generational understanding and a body of personal work and activism that bridges understanding with older generations. And I do think that's important. I think it's important to be able to see it from both sides. And I suppose at the vantage point I'm at in my life right now, I'm best able to do that. What the advantages are on both sides is people often talk about the energy of youth. Yes, there's that energy, but there's also the optimism. There's also what some would call the idealism and the will to move that forward in ways that break beyond the conception of prior generations. That's important to recognize and to understand, okay? While also recognizing that experience is valuable. Experience is valuable. I served as an elected member of the Board of Education, the only former elected office holder in this race, and I've also run in multiple elections. I've carried the Green banner. I've won some, I've lost some. That experience is valuable too. And so I think what we need to focus on is, yes, acknowledging and understanding and giving the space for expression of the activists that have been at this for a number of years, and harnessing that to educate and move forward new generations, while also being understanding and respectful of the great idealism and vision and energy that younger generations bring forward, and not doing as, and not, no offense to any particular chapters, not doing what some might do in political activism of poo-pooing younger generations and telling them, okay, take a seat back there. We are driving this bus. You know, I hear in a number of movements complaints from some young people about that. We need to be able to create a space for everyone to shine and show their talents and their perspective. And then eventually, after a certain amount of time in activism and leadership, we also need to be clear about people passing that baton. That's not always happening. That's not always the case. And it really is a great loss for our party, because we do need young voices at the forefront in leadership. Okay, that's what our party has got to do. We have to encourage that culture of that. And it's not a culture that exists uniformly and is respected in all of our chapters. We have some work to do there. I can say I've experienced that myself. You know, once again, I'm not the youngest of young anymore, but I've experienced some older, more mature activists who, while very much respected for their work, the side eye gets cast at you for even suggesting or trying to move forward with something, because after all, what do you know? Young people know what they're going through. They know what they're experiencing. They deserve to be respected and valued for that experience and for the insight and vision that they may have, unencumbered by ways of thinking that really need to pass and fall away.
It's very interesting. Moving forward to the next question, which was actually one that I presented to our caucus. One of the central values of the Green Party is decentralization and grassroots democracy, and that value exists at all levels within the party, within locals, within caucuses, within the state party, and within the national federation, and really up through the global Greens or international branch. This value is extremely important among ecologically minded people, among socialists, because we look to history to learn from the mistakes of our forerunners. We look to the Leninist one-party states, the communist movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, as examples of liberatory movements which sort of consolidated themselves within single parties and which perhaps became less democratic and less flexible over time, and in doing so alienated themselves from the working class movements that provided them their initial momentum. And in some ways that cost movements their longevity, like of course the Soviet Union, and in other ways sort of resulted in a persistence of these states, like, as you highlighted, Cuba, Vietnam, and especially today, and this contradicts a lot of what I've said, but Venezuela. The Green Party and the approach of Green parties throughout the world is to emphasize at all levels decentralization. Picking up on this thread, what is your strategy to lead our party as its presidential candidate with respect to its broad national goals and to resolving the varying priorities of the state parties, locals, and political factions?
Ultimately, Green parties, if they are adherent to our values as a party, we are all moving in the same direction. The importance of decentralization is recognizing that there are going to be different priorities and goals underneath the heading, underneath the umbrella of those values from state to state. I mentioned earlier that there's a massive housing crisis in California, and so the ways in which that's going to be tackled under our values, our overarching values as a party, that may be very different for this state. And as a national movement, we have to be supportive of that. That's how decentralization can become productive and an important way of helping facilitate our ability to reach every issue affecting people all across this rather wide and diverse country of hundreds of millions of people. Okay, so we have to be supportive of each of our state chapters and our local chapters. We need to provide resources to connect with my earlier discussion of how we bring young people in, training in order to engage in the learning of skills that will help move forward the movement, our party and a movement. And we have to ensure that, despite being decentralized, that our skill sets are universal, at least at a basic level, that you have the basic organizational skills, that you have the basic abilities to connect with the media and send out a decent press release, whether you are in California talking about the massive housing crisis or if you're in Maine talking about the stealing of water from Poland Spring, otherwise known as Stolen Spring. You still have those skills to get the word out about those differing priorities and issues underneath the umbrella of our values as a party. And I think that's where the national can be best effective and most effective in ensuring that. And why do I say that? Because we have to talk about what decentralization is not. Decentralization is not disorganization. If there is disorganization, it's not defensible, excusable, or covered under an umbrella of decentralization. Because you still have to be organized. You still have to be skilled. You still have to put in footwork and have people there to be able to put in the footwork, decentralized or not. And so national, I think, can be a great resource in ensuring that those skills are available in a way that's not going to conflict with any unique priorities for different state parties. Okay, grassroots democracy is something I have engaged in and I believe in fundamentally, and why I'm a part of the Green Party. We don't take corporate money. We aren't funded by special interests. Our candidates aren't pushed forward by special PACs, for example. We are campaigns. We are a party that moves forward independent of corporate interests that are bankrolling the single party. As you put it earlier, really it is one corporate-owned party in this country. And that's very strongly a part of our values. And so we have to marry that also with what I discussed earlier about learning the skills of grassroots democracy, because if you don't have all that money behind you, you need to be very skilled in connecting with people and meeting them where they are, going to community organizations meetings, going to local churches even. I spent a lot of time in churches in my grassroots campaigns, and I'm Jewish. People want to see you where they are. Wherever they are, you should be. And so we need those skills of grassroots campaigning to be known in state parties and locals all across this country. We need to facilitate that for parties. Now, when we talk about single party countries, once again, at this point, this country, well, let's not say it is, because the Green Party is a great force, and there's some other parties that are fighting for opportunities and choices to be made available. But functionally and effectively, the corporations have reduced this country to a single party country. They're trying to keep it that way. They've been squeezing us out for a very long time. And so we have to fight that. We have to fight that on every level, and we have to understand that the value we place in decentralization connects very well to our experience as Greens trying to get more choices for Americans, because the more that power is centralized, the more opportunity there is for abuse in some circumstances. Decentralization and its disorganization can also lead to that on the other end of the spectrum. But we know that in many ways, the ability to centralize certain powers allow for greater abuses in ways that have squeezed democratic choice and opportunity out. And so to recap, we need to, as a national party, harness the abilities and the skills and make sure everyone's on board and available to learn those skills and hone them and pass the baton in moving forward the movement. We need to end disorganization and stop covering it with the statement that decentralization is our value, because it's not covered. And we need to get out there and connect with people and show people what grassroots democracy really means, because we're not taking the corporate money and we don't have massive amounts of financial circumstances. We have the hearts, the minds, and the values of our members. And that's what we need to move forward by enhancing those skills and getting people out there on the ground.
Mm-hmm. I think those are very good points, Dario. Thank you. So we have one more question. My generation has grown up watching private companies like SpaceX and Monsanto soar past the federal government in their capacities to fund path-breaking research in space exploration and biotechnology. And especially during the pandemic, I think we've seen a sort of flourishing of, for lack of a better term, science skeptical beliefs among a lot of people, including many within the Green Party and the environmentalist movements. Um, Especially with regard to Monsanto, the instrumentalization of these biotechnologies to the detriment of workers and the environment has only thrown fuel into the fire of scientific distrust. What is your position on re-inspiring trust within scientific institutions and the scientific community, and in particular on increasing NASA funding and the funding of the NIH and all sorts of public scientific institutions in our federal and state governments?
A great question because it also connects to how this began, this interview, this discussion of trust of the United States within and outside. And we have lost many opportunities to build on trust-based relationships with the rest of the world because of our warmongering. And likewise, people have lost trust in this country in a scientific sense, not just because of its lack of adequate investment and advancement in that regard, but also because of the fact that this country has condoned and supported abusive things by companies like Monsanto, and alongside that has a history of engaging in endeavors in terms of medicine and science that have been abusive of human beings and rights. The Tuskegee experiment comes to mind. My mother is an African American woman who remembers the Newark race riots as a child. That's a generational and personal experience that she comes from. She doesn't trust the government at all on any of these things, and why would you? We talk about science, when we talk about medicine, why would you trust? People often talk about, well, this issue of vaccines. Why are people so distrustful of this and other issues in regards to drugs, in regards to medicine? Have you looked at the history of the ugly things this country has been engaged in? And so, we must recognize that while we need to invest more in medical research, in space exploration research, which has in many ways produced scientific advances that have been useful here, at home, on the ground, on Earth, we need to invest in that more. But we must also build up relationships of trust that turn the page on generations of ugliness in this country in regards to those sectors. How are we going to do that? Well, investing money seems straightforward and simple enough. And when we reorient our priorities away from war and we take democratic control of our monetary supply, we'll have more resources to do that. But the trust piece is a much more difficult issue. We have to end the rise of GMOs. We have to stop aiding and abetting the ugly behavior of companies like Monsanto. We have to take the country's engagement and involvement in fostering corporate abuses completely out of the paradigm. We need to reshape our perspective as a nation in regards to corporations. We're talking about a new country and a new world. I believe as a candidate and as a campaign, corporations must exist if they exist at all for the public good. Nonprofits must prove that. All corporations should have to prove that. You need to exist for more than a reason of making profit for the 1%. Or you don't exist at all. And when you violate those terms, you cease to exist. Okay? We have to ensure that. We have to ensure that. Yes, we must invest more money in NIH, all of that, but we need to build up that trust part. And I support, as the party supports, this idea of the precautionary principle. We've made certain scientific and medical advances, air quotes, as a country, that we don't really have all the data or information on to know the safety of, but are nonetheless being deployed and being put out there. A lot of people are concerned, for instance, about 5G. Okay? I'm not a fan at all of 5G. You need to prove to me that that's safe. We need to take the precautionary principle in regards to issues such as that. And this is a part of how we will earn back trust, while also thereby investing in important areas that will bring about scientific advances. We need both of those concerns, investment and attention in both of those prongs at the same time.
So Dario, I just wanted to ask for one quick clarification. When you mentioned that an important part of this process of rebuilding trust between communities and institutional science in our country would involve halting the rise of GMOs. I'm an undergraduate student of biology, and one of the major critiques within the scientific community leveled towards a lot of environmentalists like myself, actually, is a sort of a perceived undue skepticism towards GMOs. And a lot of scientists react negatively towards the perspectives that environmentalists and ecologically aware people like ourselves take on genetically modified organisms. They present these products as being essential for meeting nutritional requirements and calorie requirements in an era of climate and habitat disruption. So towards scientifically minded people who would levy these criticisms at the Green Party, what would your response be as a presidential candidate?
My response would be that people have engaged in a protracted, ongoing, and a long effort to ruin this planet, human habitats, habitats for wildlife, and all living things for profit. You can't sit there and tell me that we need to have genetically modified foods due to the circumstances that we are under that are created and contrived by inequality and profiteering. Humankind existed before genetically modified foods and created food and sustenance before that point. Indigenous peoples in this country, for instance, indigenous nations existed before that point, and they are being disenfranchised. Their habitats are being ruined by this rise. I do not support this. And I think that that's really just a form of sophistry and disingenuous argumentation. It's a way of supporting and propping up arguments that serve the profiteering moment. We can survive as human beings without genetically modified foods if we care enough about the survival of the habitats we live in on this planet. And that's really the answer in a nutshell. Because as the Green Party, we do care about that. And we are fundamentally going to change the paradigm so that we can heal this planet from the many wounds we've inflicted upon it. We can also thereby bring about a planet where there will be sustenance available for all without damaging the planet through organisms that have been contrived in ways that don't profitably suit our environment. They don't. They make profit for corporations, but in the long run, this needs to be a high concern and should be considered very worrisome for anyone concerned about our planet.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dario. So thank you very much for offering that perspective. It answered a lot of the questions that I've been mulling over recently. So that is all the questions that the Young Ecosocialist Caucus had for you. Thank you very much for sitting down with this interview. It was a real pleasure being able to speak with you.